The early Cambrian was a crucial period in the history of life on Earth, witnessing an explosion in animal diversity. About 540 million years ago, the seas were home to the first wave of new animal groups, some of which would eventually die out, but others would lead to the evolution of the first vertebrates. The start of the Cambrian is marked by the appearance of a vast array of animal forms in marine sedimentary rocks that are unknown in older rocks. This explosion in diversity saw the arrival of most of the major groups of animals or animal body plans. They included the first chordates animals that at some point in their life cycle possess a notochord, the precursor of a backbone, and the first vertebrates. Vertebrates are a group of animals that possess a backbone, vertebral column, which surrounds the notochord and provides support for the body. They also have a skull, cranium, that encloses the brain, eyes, olfactory organs, and internal ears. Another important characteristic of vertebrates is that parts of the head, gill arches, and nerves form from neural crest cells. These cells migrate from the nerve cord early in the development of the embryo and travel to different parts of the animal to form these structures. Other vertebrate features include the nervous control of the heart, a set of muscles to control eye movement, extrinsic muscles, at least 2 semicircular canals in the inner ear, and a lateral line system running along the head and body that has sensory organs called neuromasts. All extinct jawless fish are vertebrates. Of the 2 living groups, lampreys are considered to be vertebrates, but many authorities exclude hagfish because of their poorly developed vertebral column. However, hagfish do have a cranium. Until quite recently, it was thought that vertebrates arose in the Ordovician. In 1984, a remarkable early Cambrian fossil site was discovered in Chengjiang, Yunnan Province, China. Most of the 180-plus species found there are invertebrates, but in 1999, 2 530-million-year-old vertebrates were announced to the world. Many organisms increased in size, strength, and speed during the Ordovician, although most marine life remained quite small. The sea saw the arrival of jawless fish that exhibited a major development in vertebrate evolution, bony plates and scales. Microvertebrate faunas contain animals that are known from bits of bone, scales, or teeth, generally obtained by breaking down large quantities of rock, often by acid preparation, and then patiently sorting through what remains. Ordovician rocks from around the world have proved to be a rich source of microvertebrate fauna, which have revealed new lines of vertebrate evolution. Bony plates, scales, and possibly teeth appeared for the first time in vertebrates in the Ordovician, but the reasons for the evolution of these characteristic vertebrate features are still poorly known. Bone is composed of calcium phosphate, and some scientists have suggested that it evolved as a way for the animal to remove excess phosphorus from its body, and perhaps to then use the bony skeleton as a phosphorus reservoir, available to be reabsorbed when needed. Phosphorus is an important component in several physiological processes. Bony plates and scales could also have evolved as a means of providing protection against predators or parasites, or as insulation for electroreceptors, sensory organs sensitive to electrical signals. Conodont elements are microfossils that are widespread in marine sedimentary rocks from the late Cambrian to the late Triassic. They were first described in 1856 as tiny tooth-like elements, and became a useful tool in the dating of rocks. However, their origin remained a mystery until 1982, when a fortuitous discovery in a collection finally associated conodont elements with an actual animal. This conodont animal, from Carboniferous rocks in Scotland, possessed V-shaped muscle blocks and what appeared to be eyes at the front of the body. Another conodont animal, from Ordovician rocks in South Africa, appears to have had muscles associated with the eyes. Held within the body, in the approximate region of the gill arches, were the conodont elements. Their assembled arrangement and the wear patterns on these elements were suggestive of a feeding mechanism. Conodont elements are said to be made of bone and enamel, and all of these features are characteristic of vertebrates. Despite this, the identification of conodonts as true vertebrates remains controversial. Jawless fish, agnathans, were the most common vertebrates of the Silurian. However, new vertebrate groups appeared and diversified during the period. The oceans were home to a key development jaws, and by the end of the Silurian, all the major groups of vertebrates had evolved. The period of glaciation that ended the Ordovician extended into the Silurian, but gradually the ice melted, sea levels rose, and the oceans became warmer. While plants and invertebrates sought to establish themselves on land, vertebrates continued to take advantage of the hospitable environment offered by the oceans. And it was the Silurian seas that saw what is probably the most important advance in vertebrate history: The evolution of jaws. The possession of jaws enabled the development of new types of behavior. With jaws, an object can be grasped firmly, and if those jaws have teeth, food can be sliced into pieces small enough to swallow, while hard items can be ground down. Eating plants was now an option, and many jawed vertebrates became larger than their jawless contemporaries. With or without teeth, a strong pair of jaws can be a powerful weapon for killing or defense, but jaws can also be used to hold on tight to a partner during courtship or mating, and to carry young. Objects can be manipulated with jaws, holes can be dug, stones can be moved, and pieces of plants can be used to build nests. The possibilities for jawed vertebrates were many and varied. The sarcopterygians, or lobe-finned fish, are important jawed vertebrates because they are the group from which tetrapods, four-legged animals, evolved. They were thought to have first appeared in the early Devonian, but in 1997 parts of the skull and lower jaw of a new fish, Saurolepis, were found in China's Yunnan province, proving that sarcopterygians first evolved even earlier, in the late Silurian. However, the main radiation of sarcopterygians, including several other new and primitive forms found more recently in China, occurred in the early Devonian. Often called the Age of Fish, the Devonian saw a major radiation of fish groups both in marine and freshwater environments. By the late Devonian, the stage was set for an invasion of the land, with the arrival of the first four-legged vertebrates, the tetrapods. Devonian seas teemed with life, and a wide variety of fish evolved and spread around the globe, including the first true sharks. Jawless fish, such as the osteostracans, were the first to explore estuaries and lagoons and were followed by jawed predators, including placoderms and the sarcopterygians, bony fish with lobed fins. It was the sarcopterygians that gave rise to the first vertebrates to venture onto land. Tetrapods are four-legged animals, and include amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. The earliest known tetrapods appeared in the late Devonian about 365 million years ago, in the form of Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. They are assigned to the class Sarcopterygii and evolved from the lobe-finned fish. Recent research has established that the fish most closely related to the tetrapods is Tiktaalik rosei, whose fossils were found in 375 million-year-old rocks on Ellesmere Island in the Canadian Arctic in 2004. Tiktaalik and another closely related sarcopterygian fish, Panderichthys rhombolepis, which lived about 380 million years ago, have flattened skulls and dorsally placed eyes, similar to Acanthostega. The discovery of the fossils of Acanthostega and Ichthyostega overturned some entrenched misconceptions about the evolution of the first tetrapods. Originally, it was thought that tetrapods had 5 fingers and toes, digits, when hands and feet evolved from fish fins. However, Acanthostega has 8 digits, while Ichthyostega has 7, indicating that the number of digits was variable and only became fixed at 5 later in tetrapod evolution. In addition, the idea that tetrapods first evolved when they lumbered onto the land also proved to be incorrect. The fossil specimens of Acanthostega and Ichthyostega were found in rocks in Greenland that were clearly deposited in a river environment, indicating that these early tetrapods lived in streams or small rivers. The fossils are well preserved and nearly complete rather than being disarticulated, indicating that these animals died and were buried very close to where they lived, rather than being transported any great distance. Also, their paddle-like limbs were more suited to swimming than walking, and Acanthostega had a fish-like tail. Although they both had lungs and could breathe air, they retained internal gills. It seems that tetrapods in the Devonian were gradually adapting to the final transition from water to land. Their conquest of the would not be completed until the Carboniferous. The Gogo Formation in Western Australia is the remains of an extensive Devonian reef system. Many placoderms have been preserved there in limestone nodules. These nodules can be dissolved with acetic acid, revealing the fossilized fish within. The preservation is so fine that placoderm muscle tissue has recently been discovered, as well as evidence of embryos within the body of the mother. In Meterpicus attenboroughi, the embryo is connected to its mother by an umbilical cord. These embryos provide some of the earliest evidence in the fossil record of internal fertilization and gestation. In external fertilization, sperm from the male mixes with eggs in the water and the embryos develop outside of the female. Although the outline of Stethocanthus was similar to that of modern sharks, there are striking differences. The tail fin is almost symmetrical in modern sharks. The upper lobe is usually much larger than the lower lobe. The pectoral fins had a long, distinctive rod, called the whip, which trailed behind the fin. A third distinctive feature is the large structure projecting from its back. Sometimes called the ironing board, because of its shape, Its upper surface was studded with a dense patch of denticles, tiny, tooth-like granules embedded in the skin. The only other place denticles appeared was in a patch on the head. These features, probably present only in males, may have been important for gripping females during mating. Ichthyostega was the first Devonian tetrapod to be discovered. Its fossils come from rocks in East Greenland, and it lived at the same time as Acanthostega. Ichthyostega has many unique features that have puzzled paleontologists for decades, but new research is clarifying some aspects of its structure. Its ear region, for example, appears to have been adapted for hearing in water rather than in air. Ichthyostega certainly spent some of its time in water, but its vertebral column seems to have been adapted to a form of terrestrial locomotion. Its body was encased in broad, overlapping ribs, which together with its robust shoulders and forearms, suggest that strong muscles were used to pull the animal along on land. Its paddle-like hind limbs were better adapted for swimming. In many respects, Tiktaalik is a fish that shows even more tetrapod-like features than Panderichthys. For example, Panderichthys has a series of bones that joins the skull to the shoulder girdle. There is also a series of bones that covers the gill region. These bones are absent in tetrapods, and most of them are also absent in Tiktaalik, at least, they have never been found. And many of the tetrapod features that Tiktaalik does share with Panderichthys appear to be at a more advanced stage in the transition to land vertebrates. For example, it has an even longer snout and shorter rear portion of the skull than Panderichthys and a wider round notch, the spiracular notch, at the back of the skull.
Dunkleosteus was a heavily armored fish, but its armor did not enclose its pectoral fins at the rear. This development allowed the fin base to increase in length and aided mobility, suggesting that Dunkleosteus was an active hunter in the shallow seas in which it lived. The upper and lower parts of its trunk shield were connected only by small, non-projecting spinal plates. Its lower jaw and front upper tooth plate eventually wore down, leaving fang-like points. Dunkleosteus lacked ornament in most species, but its plates often bear bite marks and puncture wounds, indicating that, despite its size, it was itself hunted.
From their origins in the Devonian, tetrapods diversified within the coal swamps of the Carboniferous, adapting to different lifestyles, including those of aquatic opportunists and terrestrial predators. In the oceans, highly armored fish were replaced by more active swimmers with much thinner scales. The Carboniferous period could be called the Age of Coal, for the thick swamps of coal-forming plants that grew on land. The end of the Devonian saw the extinction of placoderms, heterostracans, and osteostracans. In the Carboniferous, advanced jawed fish, including chondrichthyans, spiny sharks, acanthidians, and ray-finned fish in particular, dominated the seas, lakes, and rivers. On land, tetrapods flourished, perhaps aided by the arthropod colonization. The Carboniferous opens with a 20-million-year period of poor fossilization known as Roemer's Gap, after the American paleontologist Alfred Roemer. The fossil record then reveals a wide diversity of fauna, so there must have been a major radiation of species during those gap years. The earliest tetrapods evolved in estuaries during the late Devonian, and their anatomy suggests they had to live in water. They retained tail fins and internal gills. Basically, they were fish with legs. During and shortly after Roemer's Gap, the tetrapods changed, whereas they were still adapted to live in the water. Many, including the embolomeres and Crassigyrinus, retained their tail fins, but seem to have lost their internal gills. Amphibamus had only 4 fingers, which suggests they were more capable of coming onto land. The famous fossil site of East Kirkton in Scotland provides ample evidence of the world's oldest known vertebrate terrestrial community. The fossil fauna recovered includes a highly diverse collection of tetrapods, with many animals more specialized to live on land. Temnospondyles first appear here, including a species that lacks many of the hallmarks of life in the water. Lepispondyles are also present, represented by the snake-like Astapodophyterpeton, which would have been as comfortable on land as in the water. But most striking are the reptile-like animals, including Westlothiana, which was hailed as the first amniote, although this interpretation is disputed. If correct, it would have represented the first time reproduction was freed from needing water, a necessary step toward fully occupying the land. However, in the late Carboniferous, undisputed amniotes became prominent members of a truly terrestrial fauna. The first tetrapods inherited simple eggs from their fish ancestors that were fertilized outside the body. Water was critical for reproduction because the thin membrane surrounding the egg would not protect it against drying out on land. Water was also necessary to carry sperm to the eggs. This mode of reproduction is called amphibious, and is still seen in frogs and salamanders. In order to become fully terrestrial, it was necessary to protect the egg from drying. This was accomplished by the amniotes, reptiles, birds and mammals, in addition to 3 new members of the egg: chorion, amnion, and allantois. These membranes, together with the yolk sac, also help support the growing embryo by providing nutrients and collecting waste. Around the outermost membrane lies the shell, which may be leathery and flexible, as in many turtles and lizards, or mineralized and hard, best known in birds, but also found in crocodiles and many tortoises. Amniotes further became independent from water by their mode of reproduction. Instead of releasing sperm into water over eggs, the male places sperm within the reproductive system of the female, where it travels to and fertilizes the egg. After fertilization, the extra membranes and shell are formed, and the egg is laid on dry land. Among amniotes, mammals have gone one step further, doing away with the shell and retaining the egg inside the mother. Monotremes are the exception. Since they still lay eggs, the extra membranes are modified to interact with tissues of the mother in order to directly nourish the developing fetus. This modification is called the placenta. Amphibamus was one of the first carboniferous amphibians discovered. It was the first temnospondyl to have the type of teeth that are seen in frogs and salamanders today, and is thought to be closely related to the ancestor of these two groups. Its tall, thin teeth each had 2 tiny spikes at the tip and were hinged partway down their length. Amphibamus means equal legs, owing to its long front and hind limbs being the same size, like those of salamanders. But it was small by temnospondyl standards. At the site where Amphibamus was discovered, paleontologists have also found several tiny amphibian fossils that look like Brachiosaurus, but share features with Amphibamus. These may be Amphibamus larvae, which suggests some degree of metamorphosis was already happening in this early amphibian. For example, these fossils have a long tail with a fin, like a tadpole, while the adult Amphibamus had a short stumpy tail that was more in common with the missing tail in modern frogs and toads.
Archaeocodon was one of the largest early synapsids. It resembled a crocodile, with long jaws and numerous pointed teeth that were ideal for catching fish. Flattened finger and toe bones suggest that it was partly aquatic and could use its limbs as paddles. Unlike later pelycosaurs, such as Dimetrodon, Archaeocodon was not well adapted for killing large animals. It lived like a crocodile, lurking at the water's edge to ambush smaller terrestrial vertebrates, as well as catch fish. However, being a synapsid, Archaeocodon was much more closely related to mammals than to modern crocodiles. This is an example of convergent evolution, where adaptations to a particular way of life evolve separately in different groups of animals. Proterogyrinus was one of the earliest anthrocosaurs, coal lizards, a group of amphibians that were top predators for much of the Carboniferous. Although it ate fish, Proterogyrinus was not fully aquatic. It was one of the first vertebrates to have the long curved ribs and muscles that are used to pump air in and out of the lungs. This evolutionary adaptation developed after vertebrates had moved onto the land.
Opening with a murmur and ending with a bang, the Permian saw the rise of advanced synapsids. In the oceans, ray-finned fish continued to diversify, while terrestrial vertebrates evolved a new type of predator, the cynodont. Meanwhile, herbivores were perfecting sophisticated chewing mechanisms. The rise of advanced synapsids, mammal-like reptiles, was the most important evolutionary event of the Permian, because it was critical to the emergence of mammals and, ultimately, modern humans. As the Permian progressed, the terrestrial fauna took on a more familiar setup, with relatively few predators feeding on the more numerous herbivores. The top predators of the late Carboniferous were sprawling in posture, demonstrating a less active mode of life, similar to many modern reptiles. By the late Permian, synapsid predators had evolved features that enabled active hunting. Their limbs had elongated and were placed more directly under the body. Their teeth had differentiated into incisors, canines, and cheek teeth, and their eyes had moved farther forward, improving stereoscopic vision. These early cynodonts had nearly all the characteristics of mammals. Nowhere is the evolution of mammalness more clear than in the middle ear. Mammals have 3 middle ear bones, the malleus, incus, and stapes. All other tetrapods have only the stapes. The fossil record of synapsids shows how these two extra bones, once part of the jaw articulation, were freed from their jaw bracing function to become integrated into the middle ear region, where they form part of the sound detecting apparatus used in hearing. The Permian ended with the greatest mass extinction of all, with an estimated 95% of all marine and 70% of terrestrial species dying out after volcanic eruptions poisoned the oceans and atmosphere. Xenacanth sharks have been described mostly on the basis of isolated tooth found in marine and freshwater rocks from all over the world. As in all other shark groups, two pairs of fins projected from the belly region, the pectoral fins closest to the head, and the pelvic fins closest to the tail. These acted as hydrofoils, lifting the shark as it moved through the water. The male had a pair of rod-like claspers projecting backward from the pelvic fins, used to deposit sperm directly into the female's body during mating. The final fin on the underside of Xenacanthus was the anal fin, which was divided into two parts. Its tail was completely in line with the rest of the body and the upper and lower lobes were about the same size. Archaeops is one of the best known of the temnospondyl amphibians. A large number of specimens have been collected, and because the animal was large and robust, these specimens are remarkably well preserved. Archaeops was also unusual among early amphibians in that the entire skeleton was ossified, made from bone, which is far more readily fossilized. Its contemporaries had more cartilage in their skeletons, and because these were not mineralized, their complete anatomy has not survived. Archaeops first appeared in the late Carboniferous of North America, but most specimens that have been found come from the early Permian. Archaeops was one of the top predators in its ecosystem. It resembled a short, fat alligator and almost certainly fed on fish and small amphibians. The long rectangular muzzle is the basis of its name, which means drawn-out face. Archaeops probably underwent a change of diet during the Permian. Early specimens have a muzzle shaped like a rounded shovel with small, almost marginal teeth suitable for seizing small fish. However, later Archaeops, including the one shown here, had a longer, more rectangular snout with clumps of larger teeth at intervals, much like those found in modern crocodiles, which feed on larger animals caught at waterholes and in rivers. Simoria was a small carnivore that, for many years, was considered to be close to the amphibian-reptile transition. There was much debate as to whether it was a reptile or not until paleontologists noticed that its smaller relative, Discosauruscus, had external gills and lateral line canals in its juvenile stage. This pointed to Simoria being pre-reptile, and it is now considered to be a primitive amphibian tetrapod that paralleled reptiles in some of its adaptations to terrestrial life. Diplocaulus is one of the most common fossils found in the Texas red beds, but it has no living relatives. From the neck backward, it resembles a fat salamander, but its skull is a strange boomerang shape, with long, flattened horns on each side. One idea is that these horns acted like hydrofoils by using them to manipulate the water current. Diplocaulus could gain lift or downward thrust, which enabled it to rise and sink with little effort.
Scutosaurus was a large herbivore belonging to the Paleozoic group. All Paleosaurs had long, thick ribs forming a barrel-shaped chest. The large torso contained an extensive digestive tract to break down tough plant material. Blunt teeth were capable of cropping vegetation, not chewing it. Its skull was broad and flat, and short, down-pointing tusks hung from its lower jaw and the sides of its face.
Moschops was a thick-skulled herbivore with stout legs and thick ribs that formed a large, barrel-shaped chest. It had a very large gut for digesting tough plant matter. Overall, Moschops was a heavily built animal, and full-grown adults probably had little to fear from the predators of the day. The Dinocephalians, which included Moschops, were one of the earliest therapsid groups to evolve and were very common in the first part of the late Permian. They diversified to exploit many of the ecological roles formerly carried out by pelycosaurs. Carnivorous and herbivorous Dinocephalians are known, but all of them have peculiar front teeth. Unlike those of other animals, the upper incisors do not overlap the lower incisors, but interlock with them, allowing effective nipping. Adaphosaurus was a herbivorous pelycosaur with numerous blunt teeth that formed crushing plates. The teeth were not just around the jaws but also on the roof of the mouth and sides of the lower jawbone. Although it was herbivorous, Adaphosaurus was not related to Cotylarhynchus. One of the most distinctive features of Adaphosaurus is the sail crest on its back. Unlike the sail of Dimetrodon, small prongs branched off from the main rods that supported the sail, giving them the appearance of twigs. Despite this difference, The sails of Dimetrodon and Edaphosaurus probably evolved for the same purpose, trapping heat while basking. This meant that Edaphosaurus could warm its body quickly in the morning sun and become active before many predators. Dimetrodon is often included in dinosaur books, and thus commonly mistaken for a dinosaur. It is an early synapsid, and in fact more closely related to mammals, with which it shares some anatomical features, such as a single hole in the skull behind the eye. It lived in the early Permian, at least 40 million years before the first dinosaurs, and lacks dinosaur features, such as upright legs. Dimetrodon was among the largest carnivorous pelycosaurs and was the most fearsome predator of its time. Its high skull and relatively short snout gave it a powerful bite. Dimetrodon means two-sized tooth and refers to the two sizes of teeth in the jaw. The two canine-like fangs in the upper jaw were roughly located in the position of canine teeth of modern mammals, such as dogs and humans, and their roots extended through the bone all the way up the side of the face. Although they are not as striking as the saber teeth of big cats, they were powerful and deadly. In all, Dimetrodon had 80 large, pointed teeth, which show that it was specialized for killing other large land vertebrates.